Hello. Welcome to Honeydew Me podcast. I'm Emma.
And I'm Cass, and this is a podcast where we talk about sex, relationships, confidence, shame, everything that's going on in that pretty little head of yours and between your legs.
And those pretty little legs of yours.
I didn't want to sound too predatory.
Not after last week.
Not after last week.
That's fair. I have the most wild fact I have to drop on you.
Oh my God, drop it. Drop it.
Okay. And I would assume that you have not heard of this. Otherwise, I think we would have talked about it by now, especially with this podcast. So I went home this last weekend and I saw both of my grandmothers. And with one of them, we were discussing like pregnancy and like when she was pregnant with my mom and uncle, blah, 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 whatever. We asked her, how did you guys find out that you were pregnant? Like, what was that process like? Did you pee on a stick or do you know this already?
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. We're like, do you pee on a stick? Was it a blood test? Whatever. And my grandma was like, no, the bunny died.
Come again?
And then me and my sister, we like, what the fuck did you just say? She's like, yeah, no, the bunny died and I knew I was pregnant. And she just left it there. And I was like, can we talk about this more? And then for the next 15 minutes, she explained that back in the 60s, they used to take a blood sample and put it into a bunny. And if the bunny's ovaries grew, that's how they found out they were pregnant. Did you know that?
No, it makes me sad. That's like
I know.
Really disappointing.
It was so disappointing and so crazy. I was like, how in 29 years have I never heard of this?
That sounds so
wild?
fake. I believe you.
I know.
I believe you, and it sounds fake. Like that sounds like something that's happening in some crazy coven in the middle of nowhere, Appalachia.
I was like, I'm pretty sure you were just in a witch's house. And then so I called my other grandma and we asked her the same question with no prompting. And she's like, oh, I don't remember. Like, I forgot how we found out. And I was like, was it a blood test? She's like, oh, yes, the rabbit died. And then I was just like, what are you talking about?
How many rabbits had to die for people to find out they were pregnant? Like,
all of them, because they all had to die to get looked at. So
horrid.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
That's bananas.
I thought that was insane. And I had to share it because I was floored for like a half a day.
I'm not even comprehending. That's not even a fact I can fully incorporate into my brain at this time.
You just sit with it.
Yeah.
So you're welcome for that.
Thanks.
And let's jump back to today.
Let's just wander back to today. Yeah. We're actually talking about grief. That sounds like a joke. We're not. We are talking about grief. It's not a joke.
It's not a joke.
Emma and I were having this conversation a couple of months back, and she talks about it in the actual episode. But, she ran into an ex in the grocery and just thought about the possibilities of what could have been, right? Not in like a, I wish that would have happened, but like a, weird. Like just weird. And we started talking about how grief shows up in all of these really weird ways. And if you don't have a name for it, you're like, what the fuck am I feeling? Because I feel like we kind of had to have a conversation for you to be like, oh, yeah, it's grief. Yeah. Like that's a little bit of grief, even though I don't want this person anymore. Like that's a little bit of grief. And we just realized it comes up in a lot of areas and we wanted help understanding that and dealing with it.
Because we don't talk about it at all. There is no conversation beyond like the passing of someone that you love and the allotted amount of time that you're allowed to grieve someone in society or around like, when you're talking to friends, like past a couple weeks, people are like, enough already. Like, so it's a much bigger conversation and it covers so many other things that it was just so fascinating. We were talking with, we're bringing back Shrink Chicks. So there was just no better people to discuss this with.
Just no better people. We love Em and Jen so much.
So with that, we'll see you on the other side.
See you on the other side.
Amazing. My name's Jennifer Chaiken. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, owner of the therapy group, a nationwide psychotherapy practice, and also the co-host of the Shrink Chicks podcast, co-host with my lovely host, Emmalee Bierly. I'll have her introduce herself too. We pretty much have the same introduction.
Yep. Basically, I am Emmalee Bierly. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, sex therapist, the co-owner of the therapy group, and the co-host of Shrink Chicks with Jen. I'm the one with the more Philly accent. That's how you'll know the difference.
Thank you for the distinction, because it's so clear to us, blonde brunette over here, but yes, auditorily.
Yes, yeah. The really raspy Philly accent that people always say, where is that from? I'm like, oh God, just Philly. You'll know. You'll know.
Oh my gosh. Well, we love having you guys on when it comes to all emotions and feelings that feel a little tricky. And today is no different. So as we're getting older and as we're moving through our phases and changes, we have met with grief a couple of times, and it can be a little confusing because I think growing up, we're taught that grief comes with only death or only someone passing away, which just doesn't feel accurate. So can we start with what the definition of grief is?
So for us, we say grief is loss, right? And so for so long, we've thought about loss as death, exactly as you talked about. But loss is also a loss of a dream, a loss of what we thought things would look like, a loss of the way we hoped things would go, right? Loss is about expectations and our realities that there's loss within. So all of that can make us feel grief. And we are met with it so many times throughout adulthood, but I don't think we really start to categorize it until we get into like our late 20s, 30s, and 40s, right? We're like, whoa, I'm actually experiencing a ton of loss of what I thought my life would look like, loss of friendships around me, loss of things that I wanted to happen that never happened, right? And then loss of actual death, right? And all of these can make us start to have a tailspin sometimes, right?
I think that there's kind of this idea around transitions that like when we're making some sort of transition that we're gaining something, and we don't talk enough about what we lose in those transitions too. We talk about this term of disenfranchised grief, a grief that isn't socially accepted or talked about. And there's so many times that we're experiencing these kind of transitions in our life that are really socially celebrated. But no one's really talking about the grief in it. Like, for example, getting married, right? Getting married, it's celebrated, it's exciting. You know, you're gaining a new family member, but no one talks about like, okay, it's also the loss of a life that you had before the marriage. There's just so much grief that comes up in transitions that we don't talk about. And the reason why we highlight it and want to talk about it is because if we don't understand and accept those emotions that come up during those times, sometimes we get stuck in them. The only way to sometimes get to the other side of grief is to move through it, to really allow yourself to feel it, to acknowledge it. And when we don't know what it is, when we're not acknowledging it, it's hard to really move through it. So that's why we talk about grief so much at different life stages too.
The tailspin of not knowing what it is so real. Yeah. It's such a significant tailspin too that you just kind of let your mind get wrapped up in. So when you said that, I was like, yep, that's it. That's the one.
Well, I think, right, Jen made such an example. We'll use the example of marriage, right? Or getting into a committed relationship. Like, oh, cool, I wanted this. I'm super hype about it. And then we'll have people that come in, they're like, okay, but there's also a part of me that's kind of freaking out. Should that mean I shouldn't marry this person? Like, you start to doubt yourself and all this stuff. And it's like, nah, dude. Like, it is okay to freak out about something. Am I allowed to curse on this podcast?
Yeah. Please.
I call myself. It's okay to freak the fuck out about something, right? Like, and right. So here's an example. I get into a committed relationship with someone I really like, and I've liked this person for a long time. I'm super excited. And then I noticed that there's a little change where my friends maybe invite me out a little less because they're all single and I'm not now. It's not that I regret being in a relationship, but there's also a loss there. And then I start overthinking, nobody likes me. Everyone hates me. Oh God, I'm alone. Oh, it's falling apart. I can have one, but I can't the other. And then it takes a while when we experience the grief, it takes a while for the balance to come back again. But that rumination, that's the tailspin, right? Everyone hates me now. I have no friends. If we break up, I'm going to be completely alone. Everyone thinks I'm the worst, right? Like that's the rumination that sometimes gets out of hand.
Mm-hmm. How do you identify the difference between those two? Like, how do you know when it's grief and when it's, oh, actually, this isn't right for me. I shouldn't be in this relationship.
I think that there's, the reason why we talk so much about grief and like grief at different life stages is because we haven't acknowledged it enough. And so in Emilee's example, right, where you start ruminating, you start thinking, oh, no one likes me. If you haven't acknowledged like, okay, I actually might be grieving, it really is hard to tell the difference, or it's hard to really know exactly what you're feeling. And so I think even just inviting grief into the conversation of what am I feeling, what am I going through, allows you to weigh the two in a different way. Like no one discusses grief at these different places. And so just inviting it into the conversation allows you to kind of figure out like, okay, what is this really? What's going on for me?
Now, here's the part where we're the very typical annoying therapist, because I'm going to say something that's like, oh, yeah, of course. This is when you need to know yourself and how you handle things, right? So here's our example we always go to. Jen is a very slow processor. Very slow. I'm a very fast processor. And so for Jen, it might take her sitting in silence, or it may take her talking things out with someone, but it's going to take her time to identify her feelings. I am someone who's like 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds. And so I'm like, no, this is what it is. So all of us are very different. And so understanding how you process through feelings and what feelings you feel in different parts of your body is very, very helpful, right? Like, so for me, anxiety is in my chest, but grief is in my stomach. So if I have a stomach ache, or I can feel like I'm like pulling it in, or I feel uncomfortable, for me, that's where my grief is held. But if I can feel that my chest is constricted, that's anxiety for me. And so really learning about yourself, how you process through feelings, where you feel it in your body, and what is the best for helping you get there is going to be pivotal in how you start to process this.
Mm-hmm. There was an instance like a month ago where I ran into an ex like in a grocery store, and there was like, and I've been over it and I'm not even just saying that, I have been over it for like years.
I can confirm.
But I ran into him and his new girlfriend, and there was like a pang of something, and I was off then for like the rest of the day. And I was like, what the fuck is this? Because I'm not sad about not being in this relationship anymore. Like we have both been fully moved on for years. And it wasn't until I had to like go home and look at a feelings wheel because I was like, I'm not sad, so I don't want to keep telling myself like you're sad, you miss him, because that's not what it is. And so it took me like going through and splicing up these different feelings to like get to grief, and then like you said, Jen, like bring that into the conversation, because that's not something I ever would have brought into the conversation unless I saw it. And I'm like, maybe it's a little bit of grief, but that's still kind of confusing because I thought I was so far past this.
And that, I think it's confusing for a lot of people, where all things can be true, right? Like you can be past it. You can have worked through it, and grief shows back up again. I mean, that happens in death, right? I think death is an easier way to look at it, of like, okay, I had a grandfather that I was close to that died like 15 years ago. 15 years is a long time, right? Over time, you get a little farther away from that grief, but let's say you see something that reminds you of that grandfather, and the grief comes right back up. And I think that grief is it's just such a natural emotion. And it's hard for us to hold grief and also hold the other sense of like, okay, I still can be over this, and I still am over this. Doesn't mean I want this person back. Doesn't mean I miss this relationship. However, grief is still coming up when I see this person. It is, it is a relationship that I was invested in at a part in a time in my life. I put a lot into this relationship. And even though I don't want that back and I don't miss this person, I still can have that grief come up when I see them. That was a significant part of my life. That's something that I went through. So just the acceptance of that, being able to hold both things of, I can be over this, I can, not want this person back, and I can feel grief all at the same time.
I mean, that's saying out of sight, out of mind. That is legit, right? One of the reasons we like some of the things we'll recommend. Did you ever read it's called A Breakup Because It's Broken?
Yes.
This is like yes.
Okay,
right.
I did with the ice cream carton on the front. Yes.
This is like such like an early 2010s book, right? And I swear to God, this book is really good. But one of the things I love that they talk about in the book is they have like rules for getting over a breakup, and they recommend 90 days of no contact. Mm-hmm. And the reason that is because it genuinely helps your mind think about other things and process, right? And so all of a sudden you see this ex from years ago at the grocery store and it comes up, you see it again. And it doesn't mean you miss this person. It doesn't mean you regret it, but it's just like, whoa, here was this entire other world we had with someone. It's like these chapters of our life, and we go back to a chapter and it's kind of freaky to look at it again. And then you're like, oh no, he has this whole other life with someone else. Like, right, like how different we are now. And it just brings the whole jumbly up to our brain again.
Oh, interesting. I would love to read that. Cass, do you still have it?
Yes, I do. My mom got it for me after my first breakup.
It is so. It's the same people who wrote "He's Just Not That Into You."
Oh, it is.
I love that movie.
Yes, which I never really liked. He's Just Not That Into You because I was like, this is like a little bit too dichotomous thinking for me. But it's called A Breakup Because It's Broken is good.
Oh my God, I love that. That's crazy. I love that. That's such a mom thing to do too. Of like, here's a book.
It's so nice.
Read it.
My mom would do articles.
Yes.
She's like, oh, I don't know what to say. Here's an article.
I remember that when my mom who like really was not comfortable teaching any type of puberty education, she just handed you the American Girl doll book. Did you remember that? The Care and Keeping of You. She was like, here you go. This will teach you because I sure as hell won't talk about it.
This is everything you'll ever need to know. You read this.
You read this, lady, and we won't ever discuss it, but I'm just going to put it right under that bedroom door.
Right here. Is it one of those ones that are like narrow and long? Is that those books? Yep. Oh,
yes,
God.
The Care and Keeping of You. And it was it was like cartoons, like putting a tampon in, and you're like, what am I reading?
I know.
But I'll probably give it to my kid too.
I know.
Pass it on down.
Pretty good.
Pass those books around.
I would love to get into a little bit more when things just don't work out the way that you anticipated. Because I feel like, they can still work out well, but if they didn't work out the way you were anticipating, it can still feel really hard. And I have a really hard time with when I can't change something. So I definitely did not have the year I expected. I had all these really beautiful plans and some really horrible things happened instead. And it's hard because it's like I don't know what to do with that. It's like I can't go back and fix it. Like I literally can never change what happened. And it's like, so I just have to hold that for forever? That's so dumb.
And the funny part, right, this is when we start to talk about how expectations and control go together. Because the reality is expectations are about control.
Fair.
And we don't mean it to be these controlling, horrible people. We do it because it's our way of figuring out life, because actually this world is very big and scary and unpredictable. And so if we have these expectations, we think we're controlling something. We think that we can help it get there, and it's not accurate at all. And so what happens when our expectations aren't met and we lose the control? We want to figure it out. That's why you ever been like in the shower, you're like washing your hair and like having a conversation that you're like, here's all the things I wish I said in that like confrontation, right? That is like playing out the control we wish we had. And so the question is, what's my relationship with control? Why do I need it? What does it do for me? Why is this so important? And what happens when I lose it? Have I really understood the idea of radical acceptance? Right? Which is radically accepting, no matter what, the reality that I've been given.
Yeah. And Cass, you said, am I just going to have to like live with this for forever? And that's the thing about grief, is that at first it's heavy, right? It feels stronger, but over time it becomes less heavy. It's something you move through. And so, yeah, the control piece, the expectations, it's the way in which we feel safe. We attempt to create safety for ourselves in the world that's actually completely out of our control. So often when we're trying to create that safety, we're having these expectations of like, okay, this is how this is going to go. I'm going to plan this entire thing. I mean, this so often happens in like vacations, right? I'm going to plan this vacation. This is what it's going to look like. There's so much shit. It rains the entire time, right? There's so much grief in that. But the way in which we feel safe. It's the way in which we're creating safety for ourselves. But because life always throws us curveballs, there are so many times that life doesn't meet those expectations. We are constantly dealing with that disappointment and that sadness and that grief. And so the question is, how do you allow yourself to feel those emotions and say, okay, well, now what do I want to do with this? I think we so often push them away to say, like, I don't want to feel this. I'm just going to keep planning. I'm going to plan the next thing. I'm going to plan the next thing, which is a way in which we're attempting to cope with those feelings of disappointment that we're experiencing. But it's also keeping us away from like experiencing those emotions and actually moving through them. And then we just keep planning and planning and planning. And then we keep experiencing disappointment over and over and over again. Because once again, we only have so much control over the future, over what's happening. And so that's kind of a question to ask yourself if you're someone who really loves control, is what are the things that are actually in my control and what are the things that are out of my control, right? Like I can picture this vacation and I can say I'm going to do X, Y, Z. I have no control over the weather. If that happens, like how am I going to manage that? What's that going to look like for me? So it's almost putting trust in yourself to know that like maybe when things go awry, when things don't go the way you planned, to know that you actually do have the capability of managing that and shifting and adapting to those changes.
I love thinking about it as like, I really don't know what's going to happen, but I do have capacity to handle it. Something my mom does to me that I hate in the moment, but I know it's like, it's good and I appreciate it. I'll like come up with a scenario like, okay, oh my God, like what if this happens? And she's like, then we'll deal with it. Like, and it's like, okay, but that's not helpful right now. But it's like, yeah, I know we have capacity and you'll be there to support me, all that good stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, a way you can take yourself a little deeper, right? If that's like giving you something in the moment of like, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? Take yourself a little bit deeper into that to say, okay, what if that happens? How will I manage that in the moment? What will that look like? Like really play that out in your head. We tend to stay on like the top layer of that where we just go to every scenario of what could possibly happen and then we stop and then we just ruminate over those things. So instead of just stopping there, say, okay, if this happens, how am I going to manage that in the moment? What does that look like? Okay. How am I going to take care of myself? And even if you have no control over that thing that happens, what am I going to do for myself in those moments to take care of myself in that situation?
I love that.
So I'm a mom, I have a daughter, and one of the things I do a lot is like, how am I fucking up my kid, right? Like, we're therapists, we hear all the time about how parents fuck their kids up. And so when I became a parent, I was like, oh man, I gotta try to be perfect and try to not do these things. And so one of those big things for me is I work a lot. And I always say to Jen, Millie, when she goes to her first experience in therapy, it's going to be, my mom works all the time. And I'm not going to stop working. I just know this is coming. And one of the things that Jen always says to me is, well, people that have perfect lives are boring anyway. They'll be a little badass, right? Like what's going to happen? Like she has some adversity. Her life is kind of hard. Like it's the worst thing that can happen to her. And it's true, right? Like the more hard things we go through, like we do become cooler and braver and stronger with a higher capacity and a higher distress tolerance. And so many of us want to avoid life. We want to avoid failure, or we want to avoid grief, or we want to avoid these big feelings. But actually, look at the really cool things it could give us. There isn't just loss, and that there is also the gain. And it's the two sides of this.
Oh, that was beautiful. I want to be cooler and braver and more resilient. Ugh.
So you got to go through some hard
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
Listen, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to deal with shit?
Yeah.
That would be a dream.
It'd be a dream, but you'd be so boring.
You'd be
We-
so boring.
So boring, right? But life throws shit at you, and you just gotta learn how to manage it and develop that trust in yourself
Yeah.
that you will be able to handle it. If you don't know how to handle it in the moment, you will figure out how to handle it.
Yeah. Have you ever been around someone who's like pure toxic positivity? You're like, oh, good Lord. Right? Like, it's not the
I
funnest
can't
person
hang.
to be around because there's nothing like real.
Something's underneath that.
Yes, you're like,
Yeah.
something's underneath it. Like,
It's
even
spooky.
you watch Ted Lasso the first few seasons, you're like, this guy's kind of annoying. You get to last season, you're like, oh, yes. Now I'm in, right?
I stopped.
Like,
I stopped at the top.
Jen couldn't get it because it was
It's
too bubbly.
Too bubbly for me.
Because too bubbly sometimes isn't that fun, but it's something for us to remember yourself is every time you're going through something very, very difficult is what's this going to make me into too? Every time, right? When we really talk about distress tolerance, our ability to tolerate distressing, difficult things, the only way we do that is by having it happen. And guess what? We gain self-esteem by mastery. Self-esteem doesn't come from saying positive affirmations in the mirror. I'm sorry, I don't know who made that up. It's really not true. Self-esteem comes from mastery, of mastering different stuff, whether that's you want to learn to freaking crochet or whether that's you want to learn how to get over a very difficult breakup. Mastery gives us the self-esteem.
I feel like all of this apply. I experience the control that Cass is explaining a little differently. I think day to day, I'm okay with things changing and things not going how I expected them to go. But for me, my biggest control issue is how my long term is changing and is a lot different than how I thought it would look when I was in my early 20s. So I already thought I'd be married, kids, ready to go by 28. Like, I thought I would just have it all locked up. And the fact that that keeps changing and keeps pushing back, that's what I have a really hard time with. And I do what you say, which I thought was a great coping mechanism, which was being like, okay, then this is what it's going to look like. And when I'm 30, this is what it'll look like. And then but then by the time like that next marker comes, I'm usually disappointed because I've been single for a while. But I do feel like all of this still applies, obviously, to these longer term and like bigger picture disappointments and grief and issues with control.
And I think what you're speaking to is what a lot of women go through. Especially in this generation, right? We saw the generation before us, they all got married at like 21 and like had babies immediately, right? And so we looked at the generation before us and we said, okay, like I'm going to be on that timeline, right? Like that was the timeline I'm going to follow. And that's what society is telling me is the right timeline or the timeline I should be on. And so we're constantly fighting against these like societal expectations as well that we have internalized to feel like, oh, this is what I should be doing. And what we find out is, number one, life doesn't look like that. Number two, maybe the things that I actually want for myself are different than what society is telling me I should do. And so it gives you almost the opportunity to look at like, what do I want, and how is my life turning out? Maybe it's different than how I expected it to turn out. And is that okay for me, right? Like, how do I work through that? What do I want to do with this? Something that comes up a lot for me is I'm child-free by choice. And I'm always hearing people come up to me and say, oh, like, you're going to change your mind, like you just wait. When are you going to have kids? What are you going to do with yourself if you don't have kids? And so I'm always getting this kind of societal pressure of, this is what you're supposed to be doing as a woman. This is the track that you're supposed to be on. And I have had to really work through and fight through those societal expectations that I've internalized and that other people have also internalized. Because you're also, you're seeing those expectations on social media. You're seeing them from friends. you're feeling pressure in so many different areas. So it's to be able to separate out, what is society telling me I need to do, and where am I in my life, and what do I want for myself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting though. There's nothing wrong with having goals, right? You're like, okay, I want to, if I want to get married, I want to have kids, or I want to buy this house or whatever. The issue is how specific those ages are, right? It's fine to say to myself, I would like to have kids one day, or I would like to own, whatever. I want to be able to own a house one day, or have my own business, whatever those things. But if I say to myself, but I have to do it by this time, that's when we get unfair to ourselves. Goals can be attainable and achievable, but when we put them on this unbelievably rigid, strict timeline, that's when it's become toxic, right? Because it's sort of setting ourselves up for failure. It's a setup. Because what are the chances that that very specific age happens? And here's the deal. You could be married by now. You could find someone who would marry you. You probably wouldn't be that happy in it. Right? It's what I tell everyone all the time. If your only goal is to get married, that's actually not that hard to do. You will find someone to marry you, but it probably won't be the world's best relationship. You probably won't be that happy, and that's fine if that's the only thing you care about. But if you expand it, if you zoom out, what's the point of why I want these things, right? Same thing with kids. What is the point of wanting to have kids? Just because everyone told you to? Just because you feel like you should? Just because, or you feel like there's this timeline of, oh man, I'm going to be 35, I better do it, right? All of these things, it's all of this pressure. So ask yourself, why do I want to do the things I think I want to do? Where did these come from?
And then working through that grief that comes with like those plans. Like I'm thinking specifically of kids. Like I do want kids. I've known that since I was a kid as well. And I think about, okay, if I can't have kids, like naturally, because my timeline has shifted, it's like I'm preemptively grieving that already. And like, that's still really hard for me to process and like to think about, like, I'm going to have to grieve this huge thing that I always imagined for myself, or like I might have to, because it might not look like how I wanted it to look. And that's really hard. That's like really hard to think about.
It's funny that in some way I love that egg freezing is so mainstream now, right? Like I think it's really cool. It's like, yeah, let's give women more choices. But I've also noticed the flip side of it. It also makes women freaking out because everyone's like, oh, freeze your eggs before 35. And then it's like, that means that I'll die at 35. Like my body is going to set on fire. My mom had me at 43. Right? Like, and I'm pretty cool.
She is. I can attest to that.
Right? Like 43 without fertility treatment, like tried, couldn't get pregnant in her 30s. And then by chance, a lot of us in our late 30s and 40s have what we call the going on a business sale and you start dropping a lot of eggs at once. But these things that I think sometimes are meant to empower us as women can also put more restraints on us because it's like, well, if I don't freeze them now, it'll never happen. But like, that's not necessarily true either. And sometimes, in this day and age, it's so great we have resources and information, but there is such a thing as too much information. Right now, you can order a freaking test off Amazon to test your fertility at home. Like, I don't know if that's really helping us the way we think it is, y'all. It feels like it could be more stressful. And so I think the hard part is saying like, hey, these are my goals. What would feel comfortable for me with reaching them? If egg freezing is something for you, that's great. If that really feels empowering. If it doesn't feel empowering and if it feels like pressure, then maybe it isn't the right thing to do right now. But all of these things, you have to understand that life is not as rigid. Our bodies aren't as rigid. All the stuff that we think it is and we've been told for years.
Yeah, it's like that is it, everything just comes with a timeline these days. I feel like you're exactly like you're saying. I think that has helped a lot of us who are anxious. I don't know, compartmentalize and be like, okay, timelines, great.
Yes.
But then also those of us who are anxious who don't meet those timelines. Yeah, it like you go into that tailspin after that we were talking about.
I mean, we were talking about this yesterday, Jen and I was like, okay, so like they say like 35 to 45 is your like prime money making years. So I'm like, oh man, I got to get to work. I'm in this, you know what I mean? Like, here's my financial goals. And I was like, oh God, I feel very tired already. I'm like talking nonstop into Jen's ear. She's like, please stop talking to me about this. And so I think any any of these things, but we do it once again. It's a false sense of control because I said to myself, okay, so if I use 35 to 45 to really do it, then my life will be okay. It's not necessarily true. Illness could happen. Natural disaster could happen. I get hit up in a Ponzi scheme. Who knows, right? Like things can happen in life. But it is a false sense of control that we really like because the world is scary. The same way like we don't like talking about something like death. It's coming for us. We know it is. But so many of us feel like I don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, right? How many people have been like, oh, I'm uncomfortable at funerals or I'm uncomfortable in a hospital? Because we do not like looking at the reality of our own mortality because it's control.
Are you the person starting the Ponzi scheme, or are you like like did someone get you?
running
I'm
a
sorry.
I think if I lost all my money, I would have bought into the Ponzi scheme.
I see.
I think if I ended up with a lot of money, I started the Ponzi scheme, but it also seems like they either end up in jail or like, a
I'll come visit
murder-suicide
you
situation. Yeah. I don't know enough about numbers to actually start a Ponzi scheme.
I feel like it wouldn't go that far.
Yeah, I would. I'd be like, I don't know. I wouldn't be one for that, but I do think I could be a cult leader. So
Definitely.
I don't think Ponzi scheme, but I do think I could be a cult leader. And I do think there's probably some money in that.
I'd join. I'm not gonna lie. If you told me that there was like this really great thing happening and
therapy
like
cult.
Yeah.
Well, this is how people end up in cults, right? Because it's like, oh, they're telling me here's the way, right? It's why we like things like cults or even like, extremist religion. It's because we don't want to feel like the world is so scary and unpredictable. We want safety. All human beings do, right? This is when we look at research. They do research of like monkeys, and monkeys will go to right, they'll have this research where they have like a baby monkey with a like piece of metal, like a fake monkey in there, but it has food with it. And then there's a monkey with a big stuffed animal, but there's no food. They will stay with the stuffed animal one over the food that they need to live because it gives safety and like emotional support, softness. We want softness in life. Life is scary. And so we do these things to create that for us. It's like putting ourselves in our own little bubble boy situation. It doesn't mean that we're bad. Control doesn't mean we're bad. It means we're trying to figure some shit out, and life is hard. So hard. Which is why you'll join my cult.
Yes, which is why if you go to my website, there's a t-shirt. If there's a t-shirt, I would sign up for almost anything.
Oh my gosh.
We can make a t-shirt.
We can make you a t-shirt. No problem, right? Sign up for it. When I got into grad school, I remember I was like, oh, look at this free t-shirt. And now my husband, at the time my partner, it was like, that's the most expensive t-shirt you're going to have in your entire life. That shit is not free, lady. And I was like, oh, nothing's free, guys.
I love anything free.
Duh.
Yeah. Even if I don't want it, I'm like, I'll take it.
Helps to pad the grief. Are there any other unexpected ways that grief shows up in our lives?
Unexpected. I think a lot of it's unexpected, isn't it?
I think let's go back and talk about the disenfranchised grief that Jen briefly talked about at the beginning of this episode. So disenfranchised grief is the grief that's not socially acceptable or celebrated, right? Disenfranchised grief can happen if you have a miscarriage or an abortion. Disenfranchised grief, I think when pets pass away, that is like, right, people kind of ignore it. They're like, oh, whatever, it's just a cat. Like, no, man, that was my soulmate. Disenfranchised grief can be, I missed the bus this morning, and now my entire day is off. Disenfranchised grief can be, sometimes it's hard being a woman in this world because it's not socially, I don't have as much social power. All of those we can feel, but because they're not brought up, because they're not mainstream, we're left alone with them and they isolate us. And I think that's when grief really comes so unexpectedly, is because we feel so alone from it. So I think all of that is lost. But shit, even going to college is grief, right? Like getting married is grief. Having kids is grief. Getting engaged is grief. And people think you shouldn't feel that way because it's something good, right? Let's say I'm really excited. I choose a new job and it's an exciting opportunity and I really like it, but I'm also sad and I'm scared. But people say like, oh God, you should just be lucky you got a job at all in this economy. Like, okay, thanks, Karen. I know. Just because I say I'm having grief around something doesn't mean I don't know what's awesome too. And then I think we live in this society that's like, you know, because if you have any type of champagne problem or first world problems, that you shouldn't feel it. But it's just simply not true. Pain isn't on a spectrum.
I think that's such a good thing to look at too, is like, how are you, because it's disenfranchised, right? As we talked about earlier, we internalize those kind of societal norms. And so I think a really good question to ask yourself is like, how are you invalidating your own grief, right? Where you might be saying to yourself, well, you know, my problems aren't as bad as XYZ. And so I shouldn't be feeling this way. And I think so often we say to ourselves, well, I shouldn't be feeling this way. It's not as bad as this. I should be grateful. And we do this to ourselves over and over and over again, where we invalidate our own grief and we invalidate our own feelings. And what happens then is it doesn't give us the opportunity to acknowledge them and say, okay, how do I want to work through them? How do I want to take care of myself? So often when we say something like this on social media, we'll get responses like, oh, well, you should just feel however you feel and you should just react to everything. And like, no, that's not what we're saying. We're saying allow yourself to feel those things so that you can learn how to process through them, so that you can learn how to nurture yourself through those feelings.
Yeah.
So you can learn how to take care of yourself. It's when we don't acknowledge them that they come out in other ways that might be destructive to ourselves or to our relationships. So taking time to really recognize, like, how are you invalidating yourself and your emotions? We also get this question all the time on our podcast where people would say, like, how do I not feel XYZ? How do I not feel anything? Our answer is always like, you have to feel it. Like, you are human. And part of being human is experiencing the full range of emotions, both good and bad. If you want to feel happy, you want to feel joy, you want to feel excitement, you're also going to have to feel the other more challenging emotions like sadness, like disappointment, like grief. And so to allow yourself to feel those feelings is allowing yourself to be human.
The other thing I'm thinking is it doesn't do, if you're someone who's like, oh, well, I don't have it as bad. Like, let me tell you something, like, you're not going to get peace in the Middle East because you won't let yourself feel that bad, just so you know, right? Like, that's also like selfish. Here's an example of that, right? I have someone who has struggled with infertility for a very long time. I've had multiple miscarriages. I have like a pretty traumatic story. But like, people would be like, oh, well, it's not as bad as yours. I'm like, oh, thanks. So now I have a baby. Right? Like, that doesn't do anything for the other people for you to not process your own shit. What it does is just make people that are traumatized and then people that are shut down. It doesn't help. And so actually processing through your own shit helps the entire world, right? It means if I do that, then I can support someone else. I can support someone who just had a newborn baby because I processed through my own fertility shit. And that helps the entire world. That's the system. Jen and I are systemic therapists. We look at a full system, whether that's where you work, whether that's the family, whether that's your group of friends. And you got to deal with your shit to be there for anyone else's shit.
Yes. I hate it when people say, like, well, like, it's not as bad as this. At least it's not this. It's like, okay, one, you're just making me look like an asshole. And two, I know my problems aren't the same as genocide and war and famine. I'm not saying they are. You're the asshole. Like,
I think
Obviously.
Like, where's the nuance? People like, right? Like, good Lord, of course that's not what I'm saying. But in this exact moment, this is what I'm experiencing right here. Now, does that mean if somebody just walked out of a refugee camp, you should say, well, you want to know what? I couldn't find my iPhone charger. No, you're a dick. Don't say that. But I'm just saying, in a space, you're allowed to process and have your own feelings.
I've experienced, I feel like, what might be called disenfranchised grief in like a lot of my friends and family's life transitions, which has then affected me. And it's like, it's interesting because I'm so happy for these evolutions in my inner circle's lives, but that changes my life so dramatically. And I feel like I do that as well. I was like, but I should be so happy for like all of these big changes and how much like our lives have grown now and evolved and we're like these adults now, like how fun. But I'm like, I just want someone to drink with on a Saturday. Like I just want to like go out and get a little shitty with my friends, but like that's just not our lives anymore.
Yeah.
And
this is like holding the complexity, right? So there's a part of you that's super hyped for those people, and there's a part of you that's like, God damn, where's the mimosas, right? And so you can have both of these parts living within you. There's a great book. So what we're talking about is from Internal Family Systems Theory. Is a great book called No Bad Parts you can read. And this is what it's about: is there's parts of me that feel one thing and parts of me that feel another. It does not mean either of these parts are wrong, but it means that I can help integrate them together to understand me as a person. It doesn't mean you're this horrible family member or friend that like, wow, like this is really sad on a Saturday. Like we used to do these things and there's no one to do it with anymore. It doesn't mean you're like, man, I hate them, I should ruin their relationship. Like, it doesn't make you evil, but it makes you human. And what we don't allow ourselves to do enough is be human, especially with social media. We forget that we are human and that we are nuanced, and we don't let ourselves be it. And then we often don't let other people in our lives when we say things like, well, at least you're not experiencing genocide. Like, yeah, thank you. And when we use, and anytime someone says at least, I'm like, I'm going to zone out everything that's coming after this comment. Well, at least you have one child. I'm like, oh yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. You made it everything for my journey worth it. Despite everything. So as soon as someone says at least, just zone out, because anything that's coming after that's probably not going to be that helpful for you.
yeah.
What do you do if it's hard to be around people if they have something that you want, or they had the experience that you didn't get to have, and you hear them talking about it and it's like, fuck, like I want to be happy for you, but what if you don't feel happy for them? Like, what if the grief is so overpowering that you're like, I can't be like a super nice, supportive person to you the way I know I should because I love you, but like, how do you manage that? Do you just go like in a hole until you deal with your shit?
Well, here's the thing. This is where vulnerability comes in, vulnerability with yourself and with others, and also boundaries. You know, part of that grief, right? Like, let's say your friend gets this like huge promotion at work and like you're struggling to figure out what you want to do. And they're talking about their new job. And as much as you want to be happy for them, it's really difficult for you because you are struggling with what you're going through professionally. You get to say, listen, like maybe I need a little bit of space. Like maybe I need to take some time out and create a little bit of distance from my friend. And in that, if you want to preserve the friendship, to be very vulnerable about what's going on for you. Hey, listen, like I am so happy, so excited for you that you got this promotion. I'm really struggling with my own stuff. And so either like, you know, can we talk about something different? Can we dive into a different topic? Or I just need to take a little bit of space. Maybe it's time, you know, you spend time with like some different friends, but in order to preserve those relationships, to let them know where you are, where you stand, is really, really important. And those friends, if once again, those relationships are meant to be, are going to respect that and understand that. And for you to be able to say like, hey, I'm just going through my own stuff. And so it's really hard for me to be a part of this conversation.
So here's two examples of that. So one, I will use the example of my infertility. I have a very, very close girlfriend who like randomly got pregnant, like not expected. And she was like very overwhelmed with this year. That brought a lot up for me because I'm like, wow, I feel like that one should have been mine, but okay. And her sister reaches out to me and says, will you help me plan the baby shower? And I love this person more than anything. They're my best friend. And there was no fucking way I could help anyone plan a baby shower. And so I go to her and I said, listen, I want to let you know your sister reached out to me. I love you more than anything. And I told her no. And this is not about you. This is about me. And so you take that ownership. This is my stuff, not your stuff. I love you. You're an amazing mother. I'm thrilled for you. But right now I'm really sad for me. And so I have to go with that first. Now, this person said, oh my God, I love you. I can't, you know what I mean? Like, don't even put that in your radar. Of course, of course, of course. Now I had someone else in my life who got pregnant that was very upset and was using me as their like person to talk it out with. So I ended up saying to them, listen, it is so valid how you're feeling right now, but I cannot be your support for this. I can't be the person you go to because of my own shit. This person did not respect it at all, kept going with it. That gave me a lot of information about two different relationships in my life. And there's grief in that. There's grief in realizing, wow, this person can't see me for what I'm going through. They can't respect boundaries, or they can't see past themselves. What do I want to do with that? It doesn't mean I have to end the friendship, but it might mean that I prioritize some time with other people.
And I think so often, when we don't get vulnerable with ourselves to say like, yeah, I am really struggling with this. I can acknowledge that for myself. Instead of being able to do that, we end up getting angry at the other person or judgmental of the other person. Like, oh God, they're talking about their new job all the time. Like it's so exhausting. We end up getting very angry towards the other person as opposed to saying, hey, I'm going through it. I'm struggling with that. That is what this is bringing up for me. So the understanding of what you're going through is really the first step to that, so that you can set boundaries, so that you can express yourself in these relationships, so that they can really understand you. And just as Emmalee said, she has two different examples, two different relationships of someone who was very respectful, very understanding, and someone who had maybe a little bit more difficult time really hearing what she was going through. It gives you information about your relationships.
Grief is so much more prevalent than even I thought of starting this interview. Like, it's just crazy how many times it can pop up and how much we misdiagnose it in our own body and ignore it and then shove it away and treat it as like either like, oh, I'm just being jealous, or I'm just being sad and depressing, or like at least it's not this. It's like all of these things that I can't believe how much it's in our lives and how much we're told like, no, that's not grief. Or like you're already timed out for when you could grieve this thing. Like that expiration date already hit.
And I think, and if you're also worried about saying to people in your life, right? Like if you're worried about saying like, Jen gave like this really amazing example about like saying to someone like, I'm happy for you, but this is what I'm going through. But sometimes you just don't feel comfortable or safe to do that. This is when therapy is great. Do you know that in therapy, you get to talk about yourself for 15 minutes straight? I love talking about myself. Like where else in life do you get to just talk about you for 50 minutes? So if you're listening to this and you're like, wow, I don't feel like I could have this conversation with friends, you go to a therapist. It's unbiased. It's trusted. You get the space to process it out. It really does work.
Amen.
So I feel like you've given us like feel your feelings, go to therapy. What are some other ways that we can really process and work through grief?
The first thing I'm going to say is just give yourself time. Right? Like know that time really does help. It doesn't, especially depending on what the grief is. It might not heal it, right? Like sometimes time doesn't take away the grief completely, but it definitely allows you to get some space from it. It doesn't feel as heavy. So giving yourself time, recognizing that the heaviness that you feel from the grief is not going to be as heavy for the rest of time. Know that you will not feel it as strongly over time.
So you talk about feel your feelings, but to feel our feelings, we have to identify our feelings. So somebody had the great example of a feelings wheel. If you can't figure out what it is, what you're feeling in this body, but you just feel icky, pull out a feelings wheel. You can Google it. They're literally everywhere. It's very easy to access. Pull a feelings wheel and say, okay, well, I don't feel that. And if you can't figure out what I'm feeling, start with what you're not feeling. I know I don't feel this. I know I don't feel this. Wait, that one might be something. Start to write those down. So you start to identify, and then you start to say, okay, what's my body feeling with this emotion? By helping and understand where we feel our feelings in our bodies, it makes it there's an opportunity to identify them faster, right? So the thing that we always talk about on our podcast on Shrink Chicks is insight, awareness, action. So if I have the insight of here's my feelings and what it brings up for me, the next time I can have the awareness. Oh, wait, my stomach's hurting. My chest is restricted. I know what this is. I have felt this before. And then that allows you to move into the action phase of, okay, when I'm feeling grief, here are the things I know that I need. I know that I actually need alone time. Jen, who's very introverted, actually might need more social time. And this is when we start to get the idea of what we call as opposite action, doing opposite action. For me, when I feel big feelings, I want to talk to everyone about it. I want to talk and I want to not stop talking. But actually, that's not the best thing for me because I get a bunch of opinions that don't matter and then I get more anxious and overwhelmed. So what I have to do is not talk and to individually process. What Jen might have to do is actually talk to people so that she doesn't isolate. So once again, knowing yourself allows you to move into the action phase of doing something different, practicing opposite action.
That's the first time I've heard that, and I love it. I think I'm more of a chatter. I think I would say that, right, Cass?
Mm-hmm. I think
I'm
both. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, Cass is usually my emotional validator. And I've acknowledged that I use her as like someone that validates whether or not I can feel things. But yeah, I'm definitely a chatter. And so I love that action that we can do.
Yeah,
Opposite.
absolutely.
Oh, God, this has been so insightful and so good. As always, you guys like flush out the most complicated feelings and like validate it and then explain it for us. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. We really appreciate it. We love coming on the show.
Yes, it's so great to see you both.
Where can our listeners continue connecting with you, find your podcast, all of that good stuff?
So you can hear us talk nonstop at Shrink Chicks, anywhere that you get listen to your podcast. We're also on Instagram at Shrink Chicks.
And if you are looking to be matched with a therapist to talk about your grief or anything else that's coming up for you, we are here to help. We own a therapy practice called the Therapy Group. We are nationwide. So if you are wondering if we have a therapist for you, you can fill out a contact form at thetherapygroup.com/contact. Emmalee and I match every single person with a therapist to make sure that you have a therapist that's the right fit for you. So feel free to reach on out if you're looking for support.
I grieve every time Jen and Em leave us. So thank you so much for hanging out. Also, I had a little touch of the COVID during that interview, so that's why I sound different. Because I'm registering now that I sound different before this episode and now after it, because I have volume and I'm not coughing my way through this sentence. So I had a touch of the COVID and I'm better now. So thank you for hanging out and hanging with us.
Yeah. You can head on over to Apple Podcasts to rate, review, and subscribe to Honeydew Me. You can leave us a written review. You can rate us on Spotify. You can watch us on YouTube. And if you ever have an episode suggestion or a question that you want answered, or you just want to talk to us, you can head to the link in our bios and submit that there. Just don't make it creepy and don't make it a dick pic. And that's it.
And that's all I have to say.
Yeah.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Goodbye.